Okay, we are out at the car and I've already gone ahead, got it up on jack stands, got the tires off, and I've got a couple other steps already completed that I'm just gonna breeze over just to keep this video short and sweet as we're talking about getting the solid spherical bearings installed into the rear knuckles on both left and right sides of the car. So if we swing underneath, this right here is the bearing that we're going to be removing and replacing with the one from RV6 today. So I've already got the lower control arms removed. So that would span from here over to that clevis in the subframe right there. So it should be pretty clear that you're going to need to drop your lower control arm. You don't need to decouple it from your subframe, but you will need to disconnect your end links from your sway bar, and then you'll need to undo this bolt, drop the arm down, and pull your spring and spring caps out. But once you do that, that's all you need to do in order to get access to be able to pop this bearing out. As far as tools go, I'd recommend getting one of these, a ball joint or a bearing remover kit. You can rent these from your auto parts store. They've got a lot of different kind of sizes that you can play with to see what fits the housing. And then at a bare minimum, you're gonna need a socket set and some snap ring pliers. Some other things might make it a little easier, an impact gun, a flathead screwdriver. So I'm gonna get the camera set up and we'll start setting up the bearing remover, and I believe those are the caps that I'm gonna be using. And we'll get the stock bearing pulled out and compare it to the solid one from RV6. Okay, I've got the clamp and everything set up and kind of snugly in place. So I'm going to be driving out the bearing towards the front of the car, and you can see I've got the tube section right here, and that's what's going to catch the bearing or allow it to protrude inside of the pipe as it's being pressed out. And then the rod's going to be doing the driving from the left-hand side. Okay, so I've got the bearing driven out, and unfortunately this one actually split in half on me, so I separated the main rubber portion and inner sleeve of this bearing from the housing, which made it a little bit more difficult to remove. I actually had to find a driver. I should have found a driver that fit this diameter exactly in the first step, and then it would have came out in one piece. I tried to take a shortcut like I did on the opposite side, which worked that time, but not this time. So for reference, about a 1-inch socket works pretty good for driving that out. That fit the diameter pretty well and was able to pop it out. But from RV6, this is what you're gonna get. You're gonna get 2 of these, and it's zip tied and held together, and that's just to hold these 2 spacers in place. So you can see these are the 2 from the opposite side of the vehicle that I have sitting loose while I'm waiting to put the whole kit and caboodle back together. And then on this, you have 1 flanged edge, and that is going to face towards the front of the vehicle. So you're going to drive it from the front to the back. And then on the back side, you're going to install the 1 silver shim and then your snap ring on the other side of it, right in this groove here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the zip tie and get these spacers set aside and saved for later, and then we'll try and get this pressed into the rear knuckle. Okay, so I'm getting ready to install the RV6 bearing, and I'm actually going to go about installing this in a little bit different of a manner than I used to remove the stock one. I'll be honest with you, the ball joint removal tool worked, and it will work to install them, but it is heavy and cumbersome and hard to get aligned, especially if you're working by yourself. So what I've used to install some of these bearings in the past is actually just a pretty simple bolt, washer, and pipe section method. So I've had some of these sections of pipe laying around. I've got a couple here that I was just test fitting. This one looks like it is about the right size to allow the end of this bearing to insert into it, because that will protrude past the knuckle face a little bit, so you can put the snap ring in, and that'll allow it to insert into this slightly, and yet it's small enough that it's still going to fit around the face on the knuckle itself. Otherwise, I believe this is an M16 screw, and that looks like it fits just about perfectly over this bearing. And then I've just got some stacks of washers here that I'm gonna use to make up the joint and kind of clamp everything together. So this should help keep everything square and centered, and honestly a lot less pieces to manage as I'm getting everything pressed up. So I'm gonna get everything mounted in the car in a way that I'm happy with, and then we'll go to press the bearing in. Okay, here we've got everything stacked together, so you can see I have the socket that I'm gonna be driving my bolt head in with, a couple of stacked washers to distribute the load over the front flange of the bearing. Remember, we're driving this from the front towards the rear. So there's the bearing, then we've got the rear knuckle housing, and then there's my pipe section to catch everything, and then just another washer on the back to be able to, again, distribute the force across the entire pipe section. So the one thing I'm gonna do first is spray a little bit of WD-40 on these threads. Past experience of doing this, it does get a little warm. And then I'm actually gonna take the first handful of turns on this bolt setup by hand, just to make sure that it's going in square and kind of aligning itself. And then I will turn to the impact to finish driving things home. So there's a good chance that as this gets sucked in, the bolts that I was using are obviously not threaded across the entire shank. So if I do happen to run out of bolt thread engagement, I'll undo the nut and stack a couple more washers on and just finish driving it home. So I'll get the camera set up and we'll start pushing. Okay, at this point, I'm pretty happy with how everything is as far as being square. I'm just gonna give a little bit of WD-40 on these threads. I should have lubed them up before I got everything assembled to make sure I'm getting lube on the threads themselves, but now we're just gonna tighten away. Okay, I've got the bearing driven home as far as I can get it. So you can see I did end up having to stack a handful more washers on the backside just to keep the proper thread engagement, but so far it's looking good. I'm gonna loosen everything up and we'll take a look. Oh, I got everything taken off as far as the bolt and the pipe sections go, and we're looking pretty good. The bearing does protrude a little past that snap ring groove, and that is where this shim comes into place. So you're gonna set this shim right around the bearing here and then get the snap ring placed into the groove. One thing to note is if by any chance you do get any metal shavings from the housing that shaved off during the installation, see I got a few little paper thin or very thin shreds that came out. Just take a little flathead and run around the snap ring groove. Make sure you've got everything cleaned out. I'm actually going to take another rag that's a little damp with some WD-40 and try and wipe out the inside of this bearing to make sure I've got everything cleaned up in there as best I can. And then I'm going to get the snap ring in. Okay, here we have the finished, fully installed bearing with the snap ring and the shim installed. The orientation of the teeth that you use to spread the snap ring apart doesn't really matter here. You just want to make sure that you've kind of gone around and tapped it a little bit with a screwdriver to make sure that it's fully inserted into the proper groove, and you should be good to go. At this point, if this is the only thing you're installing, you'll want to go ahead and put your spacers back inside the main bearing here, one on each side. They are identical, so it doesn't matter which goes where. And then you can lift your control arm back into place, secure your bolt here, get your end link for your sway bar bolted back into the lower control arm, and be on your way. Okay, now that it's time to put the lower control arm back in place around these spherical bearings in the rear knuckle, you want to go ahead and make sure you got your spacers inserted in there. So one trick that I've used is just get a tiny little bit of this automotive grease and put it around the inside edge of that's going to slide into your bearing, and that just helps hold it in place. Well, as you're getting everything else, that just keeps holding it in place as you get everything else in line. So, and these are a very tight fit into the bearing itself, so just make sure it's lined up square before you get them pushed in, and that'll help set the joint correctly. And from this point, you can just raise your control arm back up around these, make sure they're square. So you might have to go in with a screwdriver and just gently move this bushing around a little bit to make sure that it's square and in line with the faces in your lower control arm. And from that point, get your torque set back on the bolt going through your lower control arm, and this rear bearing in the rear knuckles is fully installed.
Okay, now to wrap up the install, we're going to go ahead and torque our bolts. So on the knuckle side bolt here, we've got 51 foot-pounds, and then on this, we've got 30 foot-pounds.